Konami's back in a major way with a pastel-colored shooter that's bright and gay. It's NES Works episode 54, Wiki Wiki Wiki. Konami is shaping up to be the MVP of 1987. While there's probably no topping landmark Nintendo creations like Metroid, The Legend of Zelda, and Punch-Out!, Konami has definitely pulled ahead of the third-party pack. Only Capcom has come close to delivering the sort of quality guaranteed by these silver-trimmed boxes. This latest release, a September 1987 horizontal shooter called Stinger, is honestly probably the least remarkable of all Konami's releases for the year. But even so, any third-party publisher would have been proud to have included it in their portfolio. That's just how solid it is. We've only seen a handful of shooters on NES, and one of those, Section Z, felt almost like it belongs to a different genre altogether. Stinger, however, feels more like a cross between 1942 and Gradius, with a level of quality fortunately more in line with the latter than the former. It incorporates horizontal scrolling and a power-up system that offers flexibility, like Gradius. However, it also includes vertical play and simultaneous cooperative action, putting it on even footing with IKARI Warriors. In short, it's a synthesis of basically every action shooter we've already seen on NES. And yet, Stinger is not a game that you hear discussed often in nostalgic conversations about NES. It's largely forgotten, and that probably has a lot to do with the fact that it's as adorable as heck. Stinger is an early example of the cute-em-up genre, a niche of games that combine charming, child-friendly graphics with the traditional rake-you-over-the-coals difficulty of the shooter format. This style of game has never found much traction in the US, where hardcore shooter fans dismiss it as too baby-like, while actual babies find it entirely too difficult to play. It's a thriving niche in Japan though, and Stinger helps set the tone. Bell-based power-ups and pastel visuals may remind you of a game we've already seen on Game Boy Works, Pop and TWINBEE. And that's because they are part of the same franchise, with Stinger being a rare entry in the series to explore side-scrolling. In Japan, Stinger appeared on Famicom as Moero TWINBEE, a home-exclusive sequel to the minor arcade hit TWINBEE. The original coin-op TWINBEE had actually made its way to the US as Rainbow Bell Adventure, and it absolutely failed to garner any notice whatsoever. Konami skipped localizing the Famicom port of the arcade game for NES, though it did quite bizarrely show up as an import selection for Nintendo Switch Online nearly 30 years later. No, instead here in America they jumped straight to the Famicom Disk System sequel. Having debuted on Disk System, Stinger inevitably suffers compromises in making its way to cartridge for the US, though maybe not the compromises you'd expect. The NES version loses a dialogue-heavy intro, presumably for reasons of storage, but no other content was cut. Surprisingly, the soundtrack doesn't suffer from the alterations we heard in Metroid and Zelda. Instead, the biggest change Stinger underwent in moving from Japan to the US was a factor of the Famicom hardware itself rather than anything tied to the Disk System peripheral. In Japan, Moero TWINBEE was a 3-person simultaneous shooter. In America, this had to be pared back to 2, not because of any processing limitations, but because there simply wasn't a way in 1987 to hook a third controller to the NES. We saw this last episode with Gauntlet, which also constrained itself to 2-player action on NES. This has to do with one of the quirkier design features of the Famicom. In Japan, the hardware shipped with 2 built-in controllers that were hardwired to the console. This was in many respects a limitation. You were stuck with the default controllers and those cords were not especially long. But it did open up some interesting quirks like this. The Famicom included a built-in peripheral port to allow players to plug in light guns or other specialized controllers, but they could also just stick an additional standard-style controller in there as well. Peripherals that plugged into this port did not override the built-in controllers, so it was possible to have 3 controllers active at once. The NES, on the other hand, was limited to 2 controllers until the 4-player NES Satellite shipped in 1989, which meant that here, Player 2's Pink Fighter Craft WinBee was out, and Player 3 Craft GwinBee got bumped forward a slot. After all, it wouldn't do to have a pink character in a game, oh no. The NES was a console sold specifically to boys rather than to all kids, and gendered marketing meant there was simply no space for cute pastels. Never mind that you're gunning down adorable jack-o'-lanterns and fruit and candy here, the important thing is that you're not pink while you're doing it. Anyway, Stinger makes use of the traditional TWINBEE power-up system, which involves juggling bells. You shoot a cloud to cause a bell to pop out, and you can shoot it again to bounce it upward and keep it in play. After you shoot the bell a few times, it'll change color, with different bell colors conferring varied powers on your ship. This mechanic allows for a bit of flexibility, but it can also be a distraction. It's easy to get so caught up in watching a bell cycle through different colors that you fail to pay attention to enemies and projectiles. Stinger consists of 8 stages, which alternate between horizontal and vertical scrolling. The format change does switch up how you approach the game to a certain degree. Bells, for example, want to drop off the bottom of the screen in both modes, but the player's relationship to the bottom of the screen is very different depending on the direction in which the screen is scrolling. The change in direction keeps things lively, and it adds a little extra challenge to a game that is, in fact, considerably easier than most other NES shooters we've seen. I wouldn't call Stinger a cakewalk, you're shooting cakes, not walking on them, but it's comparatively manageable next to, say, Gradius. And speaking of Gradius, the final stage here is a comical riff on that series, with familiar enemy patterns and company mascot Konami-man flying past, tossing out power-ups. There are also bright red octopi, the design of the final stage, and the preponderance of references to other Konami games in the form of hidden power-ups, including Goemon, and what appears to be the phoenix from Osamu Tezuka's Hinotori. This only leads to one conclusion. Stinger was the point of inflection for the Parodius series, with the red octopus doing a face turn and becoming the series protagonist. That said, Konami would do the 2-player variable format shooter to incredible effect less than 1 year later with Life Force. Maybe that's why Stinger has been largely forgotten by time. Not because it was cute, but because it just couldn't compare to something as sublime as Life Force. Who knows? Whatever the case, this would be the last TWINBEE game released in the US for 20 years. So even if everyone had preferred its cute-as-a-button style to Life Force's brain golems and galactic serpents, we just had to tough it out, or else learn to import. Next time on NES Works, like Prince Meyer, we have no confidence in this game.